There has never been a more important time to move in a vegan direction. Whether you're ready to start, restart, or re-energize your vegan or plant-based practice, this podcast is for you. I'm Michelle Olander, life coach, vegan, ADHD matriarch, travel lover, and smoothie loather. And I know that it's the details that can get in the way of your vegan journey. But I like to believe that the obstacle is always the way. So every week we meet here, where I translate the tools of life coaching and Stoic philosophy. I bring you actionable tips, some laughs, interesting guests, and vegan ideas for everyone at any age, all to help you veg your best. Episode 198, The 5 a.m. Vegan, Jeff Sanders. You know, I sometimes say that I like to think that being vegan and eating plant-based is one of the less interesting things about me, about my clients, and about the guests I have here on Veg Your Best. And probably about you too, my Veg Your Bestie. But I also know that most of us, myself included, well, we don't have a lot of vegans in our day-to-day lives, in real life, as they say. So I am out there always keeping an eye out for some interesting people who just so happen to be practicing a vegan lifestyle. Today's guest is that in all caps, Jeff Sanders. Jeff Sanders is a keynote speaker, a productivity coach, and the host of the wildly popular 5 a.m. Miracle podcast. It's popular with me. The 5 a.m. Miracle podcast has ranked number 1 in Apple Podcasts in the self-help and business categories. It's been nominated for, I think, 7 podcast awards. It's exceeded millions of downloads. I think maybe 15 million downloads. I'm not sure. And the author, Jeff Sanders, is the author of The Free Time Formula and The 5 a.m. Miracle. Personally, I've followed Jeff Sanders on the 5 a.m. Miracle podcast for quite a long time. But for some reason, I never actually realized he was vegan until I heard him say it on yet another podcast I was listening to. So you're going to hear Jeff's journey from a standard American diet full of meat to adopting a plant-based lifestyle and how that began at a pet store. He mentions the documentary that had a profound impact on him, and there's much, much more. Jeff is a superb speaker, a humble and delightful person, and I really think his thoughts will be useful to you wherever you are today as you listen. Okay, let's hear from Jeff, and I'll check back in with you on the other side of the interview. Jeff Sanders from the 5 a.m. Miracle podcast. Welcome to Veg Your Best.
Well, thank you, Michelle. Excited to be here today.
Well, you know, when I did 80 podcasts, I reached out to a couple people who were, I thought, far beyond me being able to get as a guest. And so what's happened for me now that I'm pushing on to 200 episodes, I'm like, whatever, we'll give it a go. So the other day I heard you on John Acuff's podcast, and you mentioned that you're vegan, that you eat plant-based. And I was like, well, let me give it a shot. Jeff Sanders, 10 years of podcasting.
That's right.
Tell me about, first of all, tell me about your plant-based journey. I know it started out mostly for food and dietary reasons, and then it evolved a little bit.
Yeah. So essentially, my story went from the first, 25 years of my life. I ate a very standard American diet full of all the meat products you could possibly imagine. I was definitely one of those guys who, when I eat a lot. And so I ate a lot of meat because that's just who I was. Until I began this mid-20-something journey where my wife and I got our first dog, and I took him to the pet store the very first day we had him to find out what pet food should I buy for our little new pug. And the pet store owner said, we have, a variety of foods here. These are more expensive and fancier. These are cheaper. And I was like, well, I want to buy the best food I can for him. And then it clicked in my back of my head. I don't do that for myself. I have no idea what the best food is for me. And so that began this whole journey of documentaries and books and research, trying to figure out what is healthy food? Like, what does that really mean? And I kept seeing vegan, vegetarian diets pop up. Like plant-based options were everywhere. And then I was like, well, I'll toy with that. Let me test that out for a while. And so I began this probably 6-month experiment where I was trying different plant-based options. And I was going pretty heavily into vegetarian, but still eating plenty of dairy and fish until I watched the Earthlings documentary, which is, if you don't know that documentary, it is extremely raw, graphic. It's hard to watch. And I cried when I saw it. It transformed my life overnight. And so right then I was like, well, now I'm vegan from here on out. I have an ethical reason to do so. It's not just personal health anymore. And from that day on, I've been a vegan. So I've been 14 years now, and I haven't looked back in that sense. And it's just been this, it's been a lot of evolution since then, a lot of changes to how I approach it, but it's still the same sense of I view health through the lens of a plant-based diet, and the ethical component of that is extremely powerful to me now, just like it was back then. And so that's kind of where I am now, and hopefully I'll stay that way the rest of my life.
It's interesting because you talk a lot about in all your work and your productivity and your motivational types of speaking. You talk about having a why.
Yeah, I mean that's huge because when people ask me before, like, well, could I try going vegan? And I'll say, like, if you don't know why you want to do it, or if you're going vegan because a podcaster told you to, that's a terrible reason to do something. Like, you need to have something that is personal and meaningful, because on that, you go out for a dinner with friends, and then there's an option to choose your food. What do you choose and why? Like, what's the filter you're using in those moments? And if you don't have a real strong, compelling reason, you're going to do what you've always done. And you're going to go back to the foods you've always eaten. And for me to make that shift and to say, well, I no longer eat certain foods, meant that I had, if I was tempted, for me, it was fried chicken that I loved for a long time. If I was tempted to have fried chicken, it was, well, no, that's not who I am anymore. I have a very powerful why that dictates what I eat, what I don't. And I know what that means to me personally. So without that compelling, deep reason for it, you're probably going to quit on whatever this new journey is.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, I've on my podcast, I don't try to sell anybody on it. I feel like when you've sold yourself on it, then sometimes you need a little help. Sometimes you need some coaching. Sometimes you need some just strategies, because yes, those things do happen. Anytime you change, there's hardly anybody out there going, please, please, please change.
Yeah, I love to, compel people to make changes that I think are great, but it's not my life. It's your life, and you have to make that choice for yourself. And so I can tell you all day about things that I've done, but unless you personally experience it, it's not a strong frame of reference to be able to make those choices and stick with them. It's easy to do a short-term weekend crash diet, but what are you going to do on Monday morning? Like, how are you going to stick with this long term? And that's going to require, personal customization to really make it work for you.
Yeah, because we all live in a slightly different world, don't we? With different people and different obligations. But you mentioned, what am I doing Monday morning? This is your brand, Jeff Sanders. The morning, 5 a.m. Tell me, why is 5 a.m. important to anybody?
For most people, they don't like 5 a.m., so it's not important at all. It's just how you sleep through. For me, it became this realization back in probably a similar time frame, my late 20s. I was working a day job where I would wake up at the last minute. I would get to work basically the last possible second, kind of stressed out, tired, overwhelmed, because I didn't plan my mornings well. And then at the time, I had a full-time job, a side business, I had a marathon to train for, just a lot going on, and realized the only way I'll have time to really make the puzzle pieces of my calendar fit together is if I train for the marathon before work. And so I was like, let's just try another experiment. Out of bed at 5 a.m., go for a run and see what happens. Very first day, I loved it. It was this amazing sense of power and control over my time, and the energy I got from the run was fantastic. And then that just spilled over into my work day, and I felt better, felt healthier. And so for me, this was a very clear sense of I could take these hours more seriously. I could plan something on purpose first thing in the day, start the day off with a bang, and I call it to dominate your day before breakfast, which gives you that sense of power to say the day started off on purpose and I got something done I care about. And then the rest of the day feels a whole lot easier, a whole lot better because the day started off strong. So that I took that simple example of a marathon, training session before breakfast, and then built a brand around this whole concept of just be intentional, like take your time seriously and do things that matter to you, regardless of the time you wake up. Just do something on purpose, and it will change your life.
So you're saying also then, so if 7 a.m. is your morning, or even 10 a.m. if you're a late
Oh,
night
yes.
person, it's the idea of taking the first bite of what's important to you before everybody else hands you their to-do list.
Yes, yes, exactly. I have a friend who does a productivity podcast also, who's definitely a late riser, thinks that what I do is crazy, which I'm totally fine with because his approach works for him and he's found a rhythm that is intentional for him. And so I'm not opposed to that whatsoever. I just know that for me, like my best energy cycles of the day tend to happen when I can get up at, an early hour before the sun comes up. And then usually about 7 a.m. to noon are my best hours of the day. Like we're in that time frame right now. Like this is when I'm most energetic, most alive, most creative. And so I want to optimize those hours of the day, and I can't do that if I sleep through them. So I need to be up and ready to take advantage of that time frame.
So as a productivity guru, sometimes you're called, as a productivity geek, I think you've called yourself.
Yeah.
What kinds of things, moving in a plant-based direction, developing a vegan practice, these are things that have to be intentional for most of us. Very few of us can say, oh, that's what I want to do. And everything just snaps into place, that it's easy to find, it's easy to travel, it's easy to talk with your family about. What are some things that come from the world of productivity and business that we could probably use to support any kind of personal change we're trying to make?
That's a great question. I think that the approach that I tend to take towards most of my projects, this is how I view most things I do, is I give it an official project. And I have a Google Doc where I organize these things and have check boxes and the whole thing. It's a very organized system for work projects, but I do the exact same thing for personal projects, whether it's a marathon to train for, a dietary change, a habit change. Everything that I do goes through the lens of let's be intentional about it. And for me, intentionality usually starts with write it down, make a plan on paper that I can follow, that I can schedule, I can have reminders for, so I can think through and brainstorm ideas. I can have a place to collect new ideas and then think about those in the future. So it's really this intentionality of saying, if this thing matters to you, and I call it a thing in the sense of let's call it a project, a new goal you want to achieve, well, then organize it, put it on paper, have a plan for it. And then all of a sudden it becomes less of this like ethereal, weird, like I'll just eat some bananas tomorrow. That's being vegan, I guess, as opposed to that kind of just like wishy-washy approach. It's more like this is on purpose. And here's the plan. Here's how I'm going to do it. Here are the books I'm going to read to learn more about it. And then all of a sudden it becomes very kind of methodical. And then you take the guesswork out of it. You have better, more concrete visions to approach this and do it, and my way, do it a lot better, a lot more effectively. And so I tend to use this productivity angle for everything I do. And it works really well for dietary changes, for fitness goals, because they all go through that same lens of here's my plan and here's what I'm going to do about it, how to change it over time.
Yeah. And I think we're not just making changes just for the sake of making a change. They do matter for some reason. We need to hold that strong and hold the plan a little more lightly and revisit that plan. I wonder if you feel the same.
Oh, yeah. I'm constantly revisiting my goals and reevaluating them, and they evolve constantly. How I was a vegan 14 years ago and how I am today are very different. Now I've got a wife and a house and two young girls and a business, and like my life looks very different on paper today. But it's still the same general approach of I still care about eating a vegan diet, a plant-based diet, a healthy diet. I still want to feel great. I still want to eat foods I care about. But how I go about doing that, where I shop, exactly which foods I buy, those things change. But the general, foundational philosophy is always there, and that guides me through the choices that I make every day.
I heard you talking the other day about drowning out the problems. I'm trying to remember exactly how you said it, but
yes.
that you can't just have one. Well, you can, of course, you can have one idea of what you're going to do. But if you've got an issue or a challenge, you want to drown it with all the possible potential cures or strategies. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, this was an idea that I had recently that I've been using as a new strategy to approach kind of sticky problems or difficult ones, where if you try one approach and it doesn't work and you quit, well, then it's just over. And my thought was, well, what if I guarantee success in some area? Well, the only way that's going to be possible is if I attack this problem from every angle. Like I call it drown the problem. It's like, let's just immerse it in solutions so it's impossible to fail. And from that perspective, if you want to apply that to veganism, it's fairly easy. It's kind of the idea of immersion. Let's say you want to learn a new language and you move to that country where everybody speaks that language. And now you're forced to speak it because everyone around you is speaking it. It's all they speak. Well, if all you do is go to like a produce section, all the food you're going to buy is right here. I'm just going to buy fruits and vegetables, and that's it. Like, immerse yourself in the life that you want to be in, and that's all you have in your kitchen. That's all you have available. You're going to be forced into this new direction that's for the better, but it's this real like a comprehensive approach of I want to make sure that my vision is going to come to life because whatever possible angle or problem could occur, I've got 12 solutions to fix that issue, which it takes some time to think this through to know what those things could be. But if it's a sticky problem, it's a difficult one that matters to you, well, then let's approach it from every possible angle we can to guarantee success. And I feel like once that approach has been made, your odds of success just go up and things are a lot easier.
Yeah, I love that because so many times people say, yeah, but I tried that. It didn't work. And it's because they don't have that sense of, yeah, that's just one strategy, one idea, one approach. And if it's important to you, we want to be a little more 360 about it. We really want to
Right.
look at, was it me? Was it me in this situation? Was it me with that person? Was it me in the morning? Was it me after dinner when I'm exhausted? You know?
Yeah. Well, even in the world of plant-based diets, there are so many different perspectives on what that looks like and which foods you should eat and should you have oils or not and is butter included or not and honey. Like you can get into all the weeds of what these things mean and get really lost in the details. And I've been down those roads many times and I kind of quit after a while because it was just too exhausting. But I have found patterns that work for me. But I only got to that place because I was willing to experiment and try. And to your point, I didn't just say, here's one angle, it failed, I quit. Like if that's all the approach is, then whatever you are going to try is going to fail because most of the time the first approach isn't the right one. You're going to have to try a few. But then once you find your thing, it's so much easier then to kind of juxtapose what you're doing and why it works for you and why other options may not have.
One of the things I know a lot of my clients and a lot of my listeners, many of us are women in mid to later life. I think that's my demographic in general. A lot of us, maybe it's socialization, maybe it's generationally, really have a hard time failing at things. We don't have, and maybe that's more universal than I'm saying, but I feel like
Yeah.
there's a demographic where we're just like, if I'm going to fail at it, I shouldn't even start it. How do we make more, make friends with the idea that we are going to fail at things that are worthy goals?
The way that I tend to view it is I remove the word failure and I replace that with experimentation, which I've mentioned multiple times already, because it's more like a scientist who's going to do a series of experiments, knowing full well that most of them are never going to work in the way they intend. But if you do enough trials, enough errors, enough knowledge is gained from the process, you eventually figure it out. I mean, I think Thomas Edison had like 10,000 attempts at the light bulb. And it's like that's what it takes sometimes to get to where you're going. And that sounds exhausting in some perspectives. I don't want to try 10,000 times and not have it work. But at the same time, if you view failure through the lens of experimentation, you're really just asking, like, what can I learn from this? Like, what does this teach me? And then from that, how can I do better next time? And that to me, like my diet has evolved a lot. I still have trial and error all the time. I'm still testing new foods and new options and different quantities of things. And so I'm always in that phase of experimentation, knowing full well a lot of it's going to backfire and not work. And that's fine. I'll just go on to the next thing. But it takes that simple approach of this is not personal. It's not that I'm a failure. It's just that it's a thing that here's the data, here are the results. And from that, here's what I can learn and then do better next time.
Yeah, I think that's the most important thing, what you just said. It's not feedback about who you are, your
Right.
worthiness, your intelligence, or your work ethic. It's feedback about the strategy and about the idea, whether that worked for you. That's, so tell me, how did you get into this world of helping us be more productive, helping us hit hit the ground running in the morning. How did this even happen for you? Did your parents see this coming?
No, no. I was a theater major in college, and I had plans of. I have friends who went on to Broadway and were amazing performers, and I knew that wasn't my direction. I didn't know what I wanted to do, so I was trying to figure out after I graduated college, like what is it that I want to do with my life? And I had odd jobs at banks and retail, and I knew these things are not me. But it was through some personal development books that I read that I realized there are people out there in the world who speak for a living, who write books and get paid to do so. And I was like, well, that sounds like something I would be interested in. So I just began blogging. I began talking about my life and lessons I was learning. At the time, it was very health focused. It was, my dietary transition to go vegan was a massive part of my brand when I first got started because I was so just passionate about that change. I was running marathons and then later on ultra marathons and talking a lot about that journey because I loved the personal growth angle of all the things I was learning about myself and wanted to share those with others. And so the blog then transitioned into a podcast because I thought that I could use my voice as someone who has been an actor before. I could use my voice and make a podcast. And then that then spawned into books and speaking engagements and coaching, and the whole thing, kind of blew up from there, which is great. But that was kind of founded on this idea that I want to share my experiences, and people that were listening were getting value from that. So I just wanted to do more of that. And that's where it all came from.
Yeah, I think sometimes we need to find a friend or a some kind of a model in the world that's doing that thing, because I don't think a lot of us are encouraged to make big leaps and changes in our day-to-day lives. I think people get pretty happy with who we are. Even if they're not that happy, they can predict who we are.
Well, it's the devil, I mean, I think we get really attached to our lives and we just assume that today is the same as tomorrow and the next day. And I'm the kind of person where I like to live in the world of growth. I like to believe that tomorrow is going to be better than today. And it's only going to be possible if I'm doing work now to make tomorrow better. And so I'm in this constant growth phase with everything, which is on some levels I get too extreme. I push too hard. And so I have to find a healthy balance to that. But I much prefer a life of I'm going somewhere. I have a direction and a goal and I'm moving forward. And so I don't make massive leaps forward any given day, but I'm always asking the question of how can today be a little bit better? And a little like 1% growth every day will then add up in a significant way long term.
Well, you've used that analogy also about running a marathon, that a marathon is not in and of itself a complicated thing. Tell me a little bit about how you talk about marathons.
Yeah, marathoning to me is fascinating because I always viewed it as this super difficult, complicated, very hard objective. And then I went out and I ran like 20 or 30 marathons. And so I kind of proved that I could do it. But what I learned from those experiences was that a marathon is very simple. Like literally it's one foot in front of the other over and over again until eventually you cross this arbitrary line that someone has drawn in the sand and says, now you've crossed the threshold. But it's so simple in what it is. Like just walking forward, running forward, moving forward is all it is. But what's difficult is the staying power, the endurance of not quitting. And so with any goal you're going to be, up against, that's really the biggest challenge is when will you quit? And if the answer is never, you're going to succeed at some point. You're going to cross that finish line. And so it's the simplicity is always there. It's really a question of, are you committed to it? Do you care about it? Do you have strategies to guarantee you're not going to falter? And then when you do, how to get back on track? I like the idea of a marathon, both actually like literally running one, but also metaphorically running them in our lives, where we have this very clear sense of direction and making things as direct and as simple as possible to say, here's what forward movement looks like. And then each and every day saying, here's the next step I'm going to take.
Yeah, because I think we all kind of know that. I don't know, was it Woody Allen that said showing up is 80%? It's just showing up is super important, and it gets you in the right ballpark, right? When you show up. If we don't show up, nothing happens. But but then I think sometimes we think, oh, but then these goals, why should I change? What's your obsession with growth and change, Michelle? Because I like goals too. I don't have marathon goals, but I do like to just feel like I've showed up in the day, in the world that I have, finite existence. I'm quite a bit older than you. I've got grandkids about the ages of your children now. So I feel like I want to also model to them that this life is not just to be endured, that
Mm.
it is something for us to kind of make our own way in. What has having kids kind of fine-tuned for you in your growth and your productivity ideas?
Radical shift for me. It was probably the biggest shift in my adult life has been having kids. And I think in a lot of ways because of the logistics of just day-to-day life. I just recently took my daughters off to school and came back, and now my workday begins, and I have this very different pattern of day-to-day life, what that looks like for here's my time to get my stuff done, here's family time with taking care of them, but then also kind of the bigger picture of modeling a life that I think that I want to show them how to do things well, and then me figuring out, am I modeling well? Am I teaching them things explicitly? We've recently had the conversation about diet. I mean, just this weekend, my daughter was asking me, why can't I have a hot dog? And I was telling her, you can have a hot dog. It's not off limits, but it's a personal choice, and here's what that means. And she's only 5 years old, so it's hard to have that discussion. But at the same time, I want to start those talks now of saying, like, it's, you have a journey coming up, and I'm not going to force you in a certain direction, but I want to kind of teach you what, things that I've learned that would help guide you in those choices. And it's an interesting place to be in because I've not done that before. It's the first time to do all of it. So it's kind of fun.
Yeah, I think having kids is the great reflection, isn't it? In terms of like you can kind of just do your own thing until they're watching you.
Yeah, right.
And then you're like, what are they seeing? Because they see all kinds of things that we don't, you have the plan, and then they pick up all the other things that
Mm.
weren't the main plan that you were hoping that they would pick up. Jeff, so tell me, you're jeffsanders.com. That's where we can find out lots about you. And
Yes.
tell me, and the 5 a.m. club is your it's a membership group, no?
Yeah, so the 5 a.m. Club is my email list, so people can join that to get some free downloads and kind of get involved in the community that I have for people who care about the podcast or the book or just want to talk to the people who are actively involved in early mornings and goal achieving. So yeah, it's basically it's a free opportunity just to kind of get involved with other people.
Okay. And then you have the 5 a.m. Miracle podcast, which I
Yes.
have paid for a little bit of a premium. And now I'm thinking, oh my gosh, how many how many podcasts are there? How many podcasts are there?
I have got 540 episodes. I think if you do the premium option, I've got 200 some odd that are available now, and another almost 400 that are in the back end.
In
So
the
yeah,
archives.
yeah.
That is really amazing. What have you learned from podcasting? In fact, I wanted to ask you right away, what did people think you were even doing 10 years ago when you said, I have a podcast? Because I'm guessing people didn't know what it was.
No, I really hit the curve before it got popular, and so for a lot of people, it basically saying it's an internet radio show. And for some people, that made more sense. It was okay. So I understand radio. I kind of get what the internet is. So those two things together, I'm like, that's basically it. So if you want to listen to me talk, you can do so on the internet. Like that was basically it. And I said that for years before podcasting became more of a common term. So yeah, it was an interesting journey, but the show still did well for those who knew what it was. It was growing, which is great, but it took a while for most people to understand even what podcasting is today.
Yeah, it is. I still run into people, especially older people, but even young people who don't. And everybody seems to know what YouTube is.
Mm,
Personally, I don't have time to sit and watch a lot of things. That's what I
right.
love about podcasts. And when I was becoming, I think I have told my audience this many times, I was what I call an excusitarian for quite a while.
Hmm.
Up until about 10 years ago, I was vegan unless I could make some sort of an excuse in my head that, well, it would be rude to say no to this person, or I'm
Mm.
traveling and it would be rude in that culture to demand it, or something like that. So I had my excuses until about 10 years ago. And the whole idea of working me through that period was listening to lots of podcasts where it was kind of drip people like yourself who were giving me ideas of what change would take, what would it mean to assert myself when I was very uncomfortable with asserting myself, what did it mean to do that. And so many people who were vegan and plant-based were like yourself. They were endurance athletes, they were marathoners, they were people who I remember thinking, well, I guess if they're not worried about dietary parts of it. They're not worried about protein, which is always the joke.
Yep.
Maybe I can do it. So that was where when I became a coach and everything, I was like, I want a podcast where I just keep reminding people it's possible. You don't have to be young. You don't have to be in college. You don't have to be an athlete. There, you can be an older lady and move in this direction.
I think that's great. I think for me, I had a very similar story where I was looking for examples. For me, I wanted to see, are there other young men who are strong and healthy and vegan? And I found a couple, and I was like, ooh, it exists. These people are out there who are, bodybuilders and marathon runners who are on vegan diets. And I thought, well, if those guys can do it, I can do it. Like I needed that sense of an example. And as soon as I saw it, I was, off to the races to make it happen for myself. But it's really powerful to find someone else to show you that it is possible.
Yeah, that idea of collecting evidence. I remember before I went back to grad school in my 50s, it was the same thing. I was collecting evidence of older people, mothers or midlife people who went back and got a graduate degree. And I had this I called it my little mental scrapbook of people who seemed to do it and they didn't, they didn't destroy their marriages. they didn't completely fall off the face of the earth. They weren't living under a bridge. And so you kind of have to have this. And I love what you do. You bring so many interesting people on your podcast. And I feel like they all help with that idea of collecting evidence. Everybody, some guests, well, that's not what we're particularly worried about. But then that guest comes on, they say something's possible that we just weren't sure was possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really powerful thing to believe that somebody else can do it, therefore I can, because I think for a lot of us we just have that self-doubt. That's our first default reaction. My automatically, no, I can't, as opposed to, well, how could I? If I were to approach this, what would that look like? And oftentimes that is an example of someone else that's as similar to us as possible who are making headway. And then all of a sudden you see a path forward. And for me, that was really all I needed to start the process. Just get involved, get in the game, and then figure it out myself from there. And that's really the biggest hurdle, is just starting and being willing to say, let me just go try this out for a while. Give it 2 weeks, see how I feel. And then go another 2 weeks, and then another 2 weeks. And all of a sudden it's been a year and you've been a vegan and you feel great. And you're like, how did that happen? Well, it was one day at a time. That's all this whole process ever was.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I always call it a vegan practice, because I think of it as like yoga. You didn't fail at yoga. When you show up at the yoga class, some things you can do, some things you can't do, some things you have accommodations. Sometimes you're sore, sometimes you're bored. It's a practice, and you can fine tune it day to day to day or week to week. Now, with your skills in this area, how did you write 2 books? How did you use that kind of thinking? Because that's not only did you write them, you got them into the world, you got them published.
Well, the book publishing process was, I got kind of lucky in that sense that publishers found my podcast and then asked me to write a book twice. So that was really helpful in that sense. But the practical nature of writing a book for me is very similar to how I approach most of my work, which is big, large, focused blocks of time. For me to give my best self to something, I need to have about 4 to 5 hours in a row of total focus. And so a big part of what I kind of teach on my show and on my work is, how do you really block distractions? I mean, a good example of that is our discussion right now. I consider a focus block of time. My phone is turned off. I'm not looking at email. Like, no one's home to bother me. Like, it's just you and I talking. That's how you get the best results from most of the things you're going to work on, is how do we ensure we're just doing one thing for a long enough period of time to dig deep. For me to write books, it meant I had to do a lot of deep thinking, a lot of connections, a lot of pulling together lots of resources. And so it took that kind of intense focus blocks of time enough times in a row for the books to come together. I wrote the books fairly quickly in total, only because I gave it so much focus that they came together pretty fast. But had I spaced it out over time, I think it would have been fine. But I know that I work best in big bursts. How do I just put all my energy into one thing and forget the rest of my life for a little while? It's harder to do now with kids, but it is still possible. And then when you do it, you still get these amazing creative outbursts that are just very productive and very fulfilling.
So when you were doing the last book, which is called, let me be sure I get it, The Free Time Formula, the first one was a 5 a.m. Miracle. The
Yes.
second one was the free time formula, finding happiness, focus, and productivity no matter how busy you are. Wow, what a tall order. When you were doing that, did you well, I'm just trying to imagine how a focus do you do an outline? Did you just like dive in? And I hear people talk about both different ways. Like sometimes people have to write to find out what they actually think. So they have to do a lot of pre-writing.
Yeah,
What was
it's yes
your
to both.
process?
I think that my podcast is actually a great place where I do pre-writing. So I do experiments on different topics all the time. So every week when I record an episode, that's potential content for a new book. So in large parts, if you are kind of a content creator as a lifestyle, if you are a writer as who you are, you should be in theory always creating, always writing, always tinkering. And then a book, for many people, is just a reflection of work you've already done. So you're just pulling together some of your best thoughts and packaging them together in a way that's, compelling to a reader. The most important part for me, though, you kind of hit that earlier, is the table of contents and the outline. I spend more than half of my writing time outlining. It is the most important part for me is making sure that the logical ducks are in a row, that it makes sense. If you were to read the book from cover to cover, you go through a journey. You see a story that unfolds step by step so that it really makes sense. And it takes a while to kind of put those pieces together because there's so many different possible angles to go from, and there's an infinite number of ways to write a book. So I need to be very clear on what experience I want the reader to get from this, and how do I make that a compelling and logical flow. And once that's outlined well, the writing is very easy because I know what it is I want to say. And so I spend the vast majority of my time on the outline, and once that's settled, the book is fine.
Well, you're such a deliberate person. It makes me wonder. Do you ever have a moment when you're just like standing in your room going, I don't remember what I was doing. I don't know what I want to do. Maybe I'm quitting. I don't know. Do you ever just like fall apart?
All the time. I'm pretty good at giving the speech that I was this awesome person, but really my life's a hot mess. So it's totally fine.
Well, that's good to know. I think that's always very relatable, very good to know. And actually, I do know you talk about some of the challenges you've had in both the books. I listened to them on the audiobook versions of your books. I found them very compelling. I love hearing the author speak. In your case, you actually are a very good speakers. But I even like when authors who aren't the most trained
Yeah,
speakers when they do it. I just feel like I want it when you say I want it to be I want it to be the real
right.
person.
I feel the same way.
Yeah, there are only a very few people I listen to the narrator that a hired gun for that I go, oh, that's good. Usually not. But you do talk about many of the challenges you've had in terms of your health, in terms of your business, and how these tools are not just for some sort of, I think sometimes we think Tony Robbins type of person who just seems. I saw him once in person at a restaurant in Florida, and in person he is a really formidable looking human being, and you just look at him, you
Very
go,
tall. He's a big guy.
very tall and very just shiny. There's just something about him. You just go, wow, you can't miss him. Even if you have no idea who he is, you can't miss him. But see, I think sometimes we think some of these people just, well, everything works fine for them. It is always so important to know that these are the tools we dig into when things aren't working that well.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I had this approach to life productivity goals in my mid 20s and early 30s where it was just whatever you want to achieve, just go do it. There's no obstacles. Life is fine. Like I was pretty naive for a lot of what my approach is. And then as I began to kind of, grow up a little bit and experience some difficult challenges, I realized my approach needs some fine tuning. And so for me, once I, got married, bought a house, then soon after that, my wife and I had some fertility challenges. We were trying to have kids. And then I had panic attacks. And then I had this trip to the hospital. I thought I had a heart attack. Like just a series of things began to unfold where I realized, okay, this is real life now. I'm experiencing kind of real challenges that I need a different approach to. And a huge part of that is balance, right? Like yes, I love to drink my coffee and kick butt and achieve goals, but I also know that there's a limit to how much I can do. And as much as I love to run marathons, I can't run them all the time. I can't push myself that hard. Like I have to live in my own body that I have. And so a lot of my approach now is a question of balance. It's a question of what are my main priorities in my life and how do I approach those in a sustainable way, in a way that will achieve the results I want, not just now, but 10 and 20 and 30 years down the road. And so it's much more of a long-term thinking approach, little bits and pieces of 1% growth as opposed to trying to get to 100 overnight. And that was my old approach was, pull an all-nighter, push in all the energy, go full Monty. And now it's much more like, okay, let's slow it down a bit. I can, ease the pace and still get what I want long-term and possibly even more than what I had planned if it's done with a better approach in that sense.
Yeah, that feels so much better. I mean, I'm sure at different times in our lives, we have to go all in for something because of an emergency, because of an opportunity. But those 1% corrections and those, small, like consistent 1%, they're probably, I feel like people diminish them too much, that they say, well, what difference does that make? But I really think that's the secret for so much of what we're trying to do in terms of how we eat and live in our lives and show up each day.
Well, I mean, even just recently, I changed the veggie burger that I tend to eat most of the time. And like, that's a simple example of, the old one wasn't quite as healthy as it could have been. The newer one that I found and want to eat more of is way better. And like on the face value, a veggie burger is a veggie burger. Who cares? But really, whatever you're doing consistently, your habits, the things you're always doing, that's who you become. That's the food that you eat. That's the life that you live. So I'm really hyper focused on the choices that I make that are going to be repeatable and compound over time.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're making a choice every day, like a certain food you always eat, and it's not the best food, and you swap that out for a better one, you're going to see dramatic growth over time because of that one simple swap. And if you do that line of thinking more often, and you swap out a lot of things over time, that's where big growth comes from. Those little changes that add up over the long haul.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. I'm so glad that you're sharing this. How can my listeners follow you more, learn about you? Where is the best way for them to get to know a little bit more about you?
I think the podcast is probably the best place. You'll hear my personality coming through a lot on that one. So the 5A Miracle Podcast, wherever you find your podcast, it's going to be there. If you want to go to jeffsanders.com, of course, you can learn more about speaking engagements and coaching and other things I do there as well. But the podcast is probably the best place to begin.
And what kind of speaking engagements do you like to do? Maybe somebody out there who's listening today, they have a corporate retreat that they are in charge of, or they've got a church kind of retreat, something that's going on. What kind of things do you like to do?
Yeah, my favorite things are going to be interactive workshops. I definitely do keynotes and other types of, more standard presentations. But my favorite work to do are going to be more of your corporate workshop, highly engaging, interactive type work where we tackle a problem, apply strategies to it, and see results, hopefully in the moment and, of course, long term as well. So yeah, anything that's going to be along the lines of getting people engaged with productivity, personal habits, healthy habits, that's all what I do.
Okay. Before I let you go to your busy life, what is something you think maybe a lot of us are neglecting that we could incorporate today? What a 1% type of habit we could do, whether it's at 5 a.m. or 7?
One thing that I've leaned on a lot that makes a big difference is what I call my water before coffee approach, which literally means I drink water before I have coffee. But it also means I'm asking the question of what's the better choice I could do before the less better choice, right? So I'll eat a banana before I'll have another kind of food because the banana is going to be healthier than the next thing I know I'm going to eat. Like I'm just looking for what are those things that are the right choice, the better choice, and kind of, bite the bullet and do that first. And then you can kind of let yourself off the hook for other things. And that approach really puts your default response to do the right thing first, do the smart thing first. And even if it's in small quantities, it will add up and you kind of can build a habit by always leaning towards the better choice right away.
That's great. Okay, all you listeners, have a banana, have a glass of water, do something that you should do, that you wanted to do. Do it first, even if it's just a little one. I always say, I do one push-up. Now I can do a few more than one push-ups, but for a long time I couldn't do any. And I had to just make peace with the idea of doing one push-up. And when I got better at one, then I could do 2 if I wanted to, but I always do 1.
There you go. I love it. That's
So
perfect.
that's my banana and my water. Jeff Sanders from jeffsanders.com and the 5 a.m. Miracle. So great to have you here. Thank you so much. Thank you for being a role model of that Y chromosome that is using a vegan and a plant-based practice in the world. And thank you for all the stuff you do to inspire us to get up and do something different in the morning.
Love it. Thank you. That was great.
So what did you think of Jeff Sanders? You know, it's an old expression. How you do anything is how you do everything. Well, I think it's true here today, too. I loved having Jeff on to share how the tools he uses routinely to help himself and his clients and others change. These are the same tools we use for a goal like living a vegan lifestyle. So what's the transformation you're after? That's the question, right? What's your compelling reason? Experimentation, adaptation, because this isn't one and done. How the 5 a.m. miracle that Jeff talks about, winning the day before breakfast, how that's part of his practice, but that time is up to you. He talks about how intentional living is part of this process, balancing personal ideals and real life, and leveraging the role of family to inspire him as a model for healthy, compassionate choices in front of his daughters. So I hope you noticed here today that Jeff is a gifted keynote speaker, and you can follow him at the 5 a.m. Miracle podcast, which has been the source of a lot of productivity advice for me here as sometimes I call myself a solopreneur, seeing clients, creating content, and building the Veg Your Best empire here. And speaking of which, I'm not taking on clients for my normal 8-week coaching packages this summer. I think I mentioned that last week because I'm going to try and stay agile and flexible for my family members this summer as we expect 2 more grandchildren. But if you'd like to try single session coaching to see how it can help you with any obstacles in your way right now, book yourself into my calendar, or you can message me on Instagram. Because even if your schedule is all over the place this summer like mine, you can still make, honestly, huge progress on any area you're ready to tackle. Okay, and also, thank you to all of you who shared your ideas over on Instagram of what you'd like to know that you would be able to find for vegan options, plant-based options at a restaurant near you. It was super advice, and I shared it with a chef who is looking to up his plant-based game. More as that unfolds, but for now, let's cross our fingers, and why don't you get out there and veg your best? Veg Your Best podcast production, music, and editing by Charlie Weinshank. Thanks, Charlie. Before you go, it would mean so much to me and the Veg Your Best team if you would hit subscribe, leave us a 5-star review, or share with someone you think might be interested. Something about algorithms, it helps bump us up a little in the rankings, and that's the best way to help others find the podcast and for us to find our audience. So, until next week, make it easy and veg your best.